Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Prado Museum for another of our weekly sessions in English. We are in this beautiful room with paintings by Velázquez that were painted around 1638 for the Torre de la Parada, this royal hunting lodge that was a project of Philip IV that contained paintings by Rubens, a lot of mythological paintings, and also portraits by Velázquez of buffoons and also of the royal family dressed as in hunting gear, and also these fantastic images of figures from antiquity. So today we're going to focus on Aesop and Menippus. Aesop and Menippus would have been recognizable to well-read, well-to-do, cultivated spectators at the time, but let's remember who they are today. So Aesop is credited with having written Aesop's Fables, which is why he's carrying a book, probably referencing his fables, and he's surrounded by objects that allude to different circumstances of his life. Aesop was actually a slave in the 7th and the 6th century BC, so he has really humble beginnings, and these clothes probably refer to some of those humble beginnings. There's a book of episodes about his life from the 1st century BC, which is probably highly fictional, but it actually lets us paint a picture, a mental picture of this character, which is really fascinating. And funny enough, some of the things that this text tells us is that he was particularly unattractive. And this actually, I quote, if you're ever thinking of insults to anybody, you can look to this book about Aesop's life. He says that he was of loathsome aspect, worthless as a servant, pot-bellied, misshapen of head, snub-nosed, swarthy, dwarfish, bandy-legged, short-armed, squint-eyed, and this is the best, the sin of a slumbering Prometheus. So this is the image that we have of Aesop from this book. Now, according to the text, Aesop belonged to the philosopher Xanthus, and he was constantly outsmarting his master, constantly outshining his master with responses that ended up embarrassing Xanthus. And this pail of water actually could be an allusion to some of these episodes. There's a few different times where a pail of water kind of comes into play with some of his witty remarks. Like one time, Xanthus asks Aesop to bring him a foot bath. And Aesop brings him an empty pail and says, well, you didn't tell me to put water in it and wash your feet. Or another time he asks him to bring water to he and his friends after they had just come out of the bath. Say, bring us a drink of water right out of the bath. And of course, Aesop comes with a bucket full of bath water. Now, Aesop's strange and clever remarks were comical, but they were also increasingly layered with philosophical meaning and with moral insight, and his intelligence was drawing attention. And eventually he was able to earn his freedom, and he traveled to different cities telling these stories, telling these parables, and working as an advisor. Ultimately, his speeches insulted the people of Delphos, and he was framed and accused of theft and met a violent end, and he was thrown off a cliff. Now, the Aesop's Fables that we know today were collected centuries after Aesop's death, and they were probably collected many centuries later. And so let's also meet this other figure here, Menippus. Menippus actually lived several centuries after Aesop in the 3rd century BC. And like Aesop, Menippus is another freed slave, and he belonged to the philosophical school of cynicism. Also like Aesop, his writings haven't survived, but we know about them from other accounts, and he was famous for his tone that was this mix of ridicule and sarcasm, and also credited with creating the genre of satire. Now, the Cynics actually advocated very simple lives, rejecting material goods, and ideas of social distinction, wealth, etc., thinking that virtue was the way to a good life. Kind of ironically, though, Menippus did amass a lot of wealth, and actually, after he lost all of that wealth, committed suicide. And in this painting, we see Menippus grinning, maybe kind of sarcastically, and we get a sense of that character. Velázquez shows him looking out of the corner of his eye, and he looks like he's kind of hunched over, kind of makes us think that he looks like a bit of a miser as well. Now, these characters that Velázquez chose are absolutely fascinating as subjects in and of themselves, but they were in the Torre de la Parada with other paintings as well, other paintings by Rubens, also of philosophers, the happy philosopher and the sad philosopher, Democritus and Heraclitus, which are interesting to compare. We can think of some of those differences between Rubens' philosophers and Velázquez's philosophers. And Velázquez's paintings were also there with a third painting, which I think is going to be familiar to as well, this image of Mars, which is also like Aesop and Menippus, similar in dimensions, this time of a mythological figure, but similarly treated with this touch of proximity, of humanity, individuality, and perhaps a bit of irony as well. Now, if we think of those images that Rubens made of those philosophers, if we have those in mind, or you can look them up on the Prado's website, Democritus and Heraclitus, we can see some of the differences here with Velázquez's paintings, because Rubens painted philosophers that were in their classical robes, they were barefoot, they were in this rocky outdoor setting in the way typically that hermits and the penitents are painted. And they have these kind of polar reactions of being very happy and very sad. And what Velázquez has tried to do here is really show the realism of these figures. It looks like he's actually traveled back in time to actually see these people, and like they have sat for him to have their portrait painted. We see all of their individuality, their expressions are much more nuanced, much more subtle, and it seems like he really understands the psychology of these figures. They're indoors, they're in this kind of undefined, ambiguous indoor setting, and we can see that Velázquez really here is just very, in this intelligent, clever way, kind of playing with this line between portraiture and fiction. Now, Aesop and Menippus, because of the way they were executed, because they're beautifully painted, but also just because of their subject matter, the treatment of that subject matter, have always fascinated artists. They were engraved by Goya, and they were particularly fascinating to Edouard Manet. Manet came to Spain in 1865, as he said, to see all of those beautiful things and to consult the counsel of the maestro Velázquez. And he said that seeing these philosopher paintings, seeing Aesop and Menippus, were worth the trip alone, that they were so astounding, and they were really influential for his own work. If we think of Manet's series of his own kind of philosopher beggar paintings, we can see a lot of this influence of Velázquez and this undefined spatial setting, this ambiguous space, and also the way that he's pulling on this great tradition of Baroque portraiture and mixing it with these ordinary subjects in a feel of contemporaneity. So, a bit about Aesop and Menippus. Thank you for joining me today, and we'll see you again next Wednesday.